Well, coming up, a scathing report blames Ottawa for leaving many First Nations without clean drinking water. We speak with an expert in water issues who's gone through it herself. Plus, a long-awaited U.S. intelligence report into the murder of Saudi dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi has been made public. Reaction to who it implicates in the killing a little later this hour. You're watching Canada Tonight. The federal government is responding to yesterday's scathing Auditor General's report on the lack of drinking water on First Nations reserves across the country. Auditor General Karen Hogan says Ottawa must present long-term solutions to address deficiencies in their water systems. Here's Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller.
15 months ago, the Prime Minister gave me a job to get those long-term water advisories lifted by March, and I didn't get it done. In December, 3 months prior to the issuance of the report, we announced $1.5 billion in the fall economic statement to address the long-term needs of communities and to send that signal to communities that will be there in the long run and not just until March 2021.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau committed to eliminate all drinking water advisories on First Nations reserves during the 2015 election. The deadline was this March, but we now know that promise will be broken. The Auditor General says some First Nations communities likely won't have clean water flowing from their taps for years. For more, I'm joined now by Dawn Martin-Hill. She's a professor of anthropology at McMaster University, and she lives on the reserve of the Six Nations in Ohneganos. Thanks so much for being with us, Dawn.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So first, I want to get your reaction to these findings from the Auditor General's report. Disappointing, I'm sure, to say the least?
Yeah, I think for northern communities, it's devastating. It's a devastating blow to some hope people had that this crisis would finally be dealt with.
Why do you think it's taken so long? I mean, they do say that they've been able to deal with 100 of the areas, but there still are 60 others and no timeline in sight. What do you think is at issue here?
Well, I think that it needed a strategic plan. I've said that before. It needed to be worked out with First Nations in a way that looked at, as she said, a long-term sustainable solution versus rushing in and, forcing First Nations to take the lowest bidder, which you end up with substandard, often uninterested, and in some cases, really discriminatory businesses coming in to work with First Nations. It doesn't work well when you're forced to engage with people that aren't really interested in your solutions. So I think that was probably a critical mistake on behalf of the federal government, forcing First Nations to take people the lowest bidder. Now, really problematic.
Right. The audit also found that because of COVID-19, the timeline was pushed back on some of these water projects, that, despite the government allocating over $3 billion extra, but they were already behind schedule last March before the pandemic. Can you talk about the impact of living under a boil water advisory during a pandemic when we're told to wash our hands and hygiene is of the utmost importance?
Well, I think what Canadians need to understand as well, cities and towns were growing and getting infrastructure built, and as they grew into larger and larger communities, First Nations were completely left behind. They were no infrastructure was developed, none. So Six Nations has a water treatment plant. We funded it in part, which is why I think it's a really outstanding water treatment plant, but there's no money for operations. There's no money to pipe in water into the homes at Six Nations. We have issues with contaminations of our wells and our cisterns. So the problems are the source water, the lack of infrastructure, and there's no waste treatment plants. So when you're going to build a water treatment plant, you generally need the waste treatment plant. They go together. So all of these things that First Nations probably laid out and said we need this dealt with were then exasperated by the fact that things were rolled out in a way that wasn't comprehensive enough, strategic enough. And then we had a pandemic, and they're telling us to do things. Well, what do you do at Six Nations? Like, we're an urban reserve. Caledonia is right next door. Brantford, Hamilton, Hagersville, they all have tap water. If you cross the road to my reserve, they don't. They have to have cistern water, which is often contaminated. And on top of that, they purchase water. So with everybody losing employment, and many are people working off reserve and service industries, they have young families, housing crisis. So they're dealing with the economic fallout of the pandemic. And yet you need $250 to order the water truck to pay for that. And then you need another $100 to get the septic truck to come once a week or twice a week based on how big your cisterns are and so on. People have no idea the overwhelming burden that First Nations people face just trying to live day to day on any given day. I think you see in Texas where they're dealing with a water crisis and they're like, well, it looks like a reserve now. This is what happens when negligence and bad decisions are made.
What's it like to hear it will still be years for dozens of communities, and yet we're in a time where during this pandemic, we've seen the government's ability to move quickly and put money where it's needed when a situation is dire. Some communities have not had water for 20, 25 years. What's it like to hear this in the middle of this pandemic when we're seeing unprecedented moves and money being spent?
Well, they can certainly, when something affects Canadians, the government can certainly move quickly, intelligent. They bring the best scientists together. They bring the best industries together. They have everybody working together, which is what I would have done had I been in that position. I would have pulled every university across Canada in, all the engineers, all the Indigenous scholars, as well as First Nations leaders to take a strategic look at how to roll out where the crisis, 25 years, obviously they should be first, the priorities. But it was boiled water advisories. Well, guess what? At Six Nations, we have mercury in our tap water, which my study just found out. We're not on any boiled water advice. We're not eligible for those funds, even though we have a water crisis right here at Six Nations. We have trouble with the source water.
Right.
They're contaminating the water that you end up getting your drinking water from, like Grassy Narrows. They got a water treatment plant. But if you keep poisoning the water and it can't be boiled out, you have a long-term problem. So you have to be involved in management and control of your water sources, which is what the United Nations recommends. And all those things are absent from any of this plan, and that needs to change.
All right. Dawn Martin-Hill, a professor at McMaster University in Oswego, Ontario. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.